Okay, so we'll begin this week's lecture for Information Studies 752 Outreach. And this week we'll be talking about online finding aids. Okay, so a couple of weekly topics for this week. What role do finding aids play in providing access to archival materials? And how can online finding aids be developed in ways that meet researcher needs? Before we dive more thoroughly into those topics, I want to connect online finding aids to archival infrastructure, as you've noted, like to do in this course. So there are a few different connections that we can make here. Obviously, in order to develop finding aids which are placed online, you need the staff to do so, right? So processing collections takes time, and then translating that processing work into a finding aid for researchers to use takes staff. It takes staff expertise. It takes a knowledge of the different holdings that an archive has. Of course, you want to have knowledge of the collection that you're working on, but it's also helpful to have contextual knowledge of other holdings that your archive contains, so that you can try and put the collection that you are describing in a finding aid on or in context. When you put things online, you need to have some kind of technological infrastructure, server space. You need to have technological skills, so knowledge of how to use XML is usually what is used to develop online finding aids. So those are a couple of additional resource issues. Organizational culture, of course, you want to make sure that you have online finding aids for as many of your collections as possible. You don't want there to be gaps in your collections where maybe a certain subject or a certain collecting area isn't represented online. I think it's pretty typical for a fair percentage of finding aids that archives have to have some kind of online counterpart. But of course, these will vary in quality from collection to collection. But just making sure that you are hopefully having at least some representation of your collections online. And obviously that takes a certain amount of organizational culture to do that. An interesting one is relationships with other individuals and organizations. It's interesting to me to think about finding aids as tools that can document not just the collection, but how a collection relates to other collections, and maybe not just at the archive, but at other archives around the nation or around the world as well. So maybe an archives could enter into some kind of partnership with another archive where they say, hey, we see that we have collections that are pretty similar. They may even be from the same creator and a split collection. So let's think about ways in which we can unify our finding aids in order to make that contextual connection clear to our researchers. And it can be a great way to meet researcher needs, which is an important thing for finding aids to do, obviously, but also an important way to develop a relationship with another archive, which may be in a position to help you in the future, and also you can help them. So we've talked a fair amount about how these relationships with other archives and other organizations can be beneficial, and you can certainly use online finding aids as a way to start or continue to develop those relationships. Next, we'll connect online finding aids to some of the topics that we have already discussed in this class. So online collections, social media, websites, and reference. So an obvious connection is between online finding aids and online collections. As we've talked about in this course, it's really beneficial for there to be some kind of connection between an online finding aid that an archive has for a particular collection and any online collection that an archive has for that collection as well. So for there to be some kind of crosswalk or connection between an online finding aid and the online collection for the same set of records. This can really facilitate researcher access to records. It can help a researcher understand how the records that they're looking at in an online collection fit contextually. If they're able to easily click on something and then they'll go right to the finding aid and say, okay, well, I see that there's more in this collection than just this one poster, and there are these other posters, and here's how these posters are related to, I don't know, correspondence or other photographic material related to a film, let's say. Another connection that I want to discuss is the connection between online finding aids and social media. Obviously, social media can be a great way to promote the existence of online finding aids, especially if you're trying to highlight a particular collection. You can say, hey, we just processed this collection. Here's what the records creator is or what they did. And here's a link to the online finding aid for more information. So pretty straightforward, pretty cut and dry, but social media can be a great way to highlight the online finding aids that your archive has developed and maybe is in the process of developing. Another interesting connection is the connection between online finding aids and reference. The more developed an online finding aid is, the easier that is going to make life for an archives reference staff. Online finding aids that have tools and other features of them that meet researcher expectations are going to allow researchers to be a little more self-sufficient, are going to allow them to locate the information that they're looking for on their own. And that's going to result in less work for an archives reference staff. So it can really shift the work from reference staff to the researcher themselves. And honestly, in a lot of ways, this is ideal because at least ideally, the researcher knows what they're looking for better than the archivist does. So if they are provided with the tools to go ahead and be able to find that information by themselves, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And it can allow reference staff to spend more time with people who might need more assistance and just do the other tasks and responsibilities that reference staff are involved with. The last connection that I'll talk about is the connection between online finding aids and websites. If you have the best set of online finding aids in the world, but no one is actually able to find them because they're buried somewhere on your website, then that's not going to do a whole lot of good. So it's really important to have clear indicators on your website where online finding aids can be located. And that way people know where to go when they want to access them. So some people may just have a direct link to an online findAid, and that's great. But if they don't, if they're just coming into your website looking for online findAids, you want to have as a clear path to your online findAids as possible. When we looked at the website for the American Heritage Center earlier on in the semester, it wasn't terribly clear how to get to their online findAids, and this can be a big barrier between the researcher and the information that they're looking for. So why would you spend a ton of time and money developing findAids and placing them online if it's difficult for researchers to find them? So you want to have a website that, again, makes it really clear to researchers where they can find the online findAid that they are looking for. So just a few connections between online findAids and some of the subjects that we have talked about previously in this semester. So it's interesting to talk about the general process that leads to the potential use of an online findAid. So we have an awareness of an information need by a researcher. So a researcher says, well, for whatever reason, I need to find this particular set of information. And the next step, which may or may not occur, is them being aware of an archive and the possibility that a particular archive contains the information that they're looking for. And this is obviously why outreach is very important, because if a researcher has a research or information need, but they don't know A, that an archive exists, or B, that an archive might have resources that will help them solve their information need, then they're probably not going to use the archive, right? Unless, you know, something falls on their head and they're like, oh, wow, you know, I should really go check out this archive. Maybe they'll be able to help me. There has to be some kind of outreach out there that increases the awareness of an archive and the holdings of an archive and the services that an archive can provide in order for a researcher to access the archive in order to meet their information need. So again, that's why doing things like instruction, social media, reference, having a nice website, having exhibits, and the other things we've talked about in this course are so important. So assuming that there is an awareness of an archive and an awareness that the archive might be able to meet a researcher's information need, that's where the researcher might become aware of the online findAids and or online collections that an archive offers. As I mentioned before, it's important that there is a nice crosswalk between these two. So ideally, a researcher is going to be aware of both of these, but it may be that they are only aware of the online collections for, or the online records or collections that an archive has, and they're not as aware of the online findAids that an archive also has. And maybe that they don't need an online findAid. It may be that they can go to online collections and find exactly what they're looking for and possibly use the resources that they locate. It may be that they only access the online findAid and discover resources that they might possibly use. It might be that they discover and use both. It really just depends on the researcher. It really depends on how well an archive increases in awareness of both online collections and online findAids. So there are a few different paths that the research process might take. And of course, whether or not researchers use the online finding aids or online collections that they access is going to depend on how well online finding aids and online collections meet researcher needs. So how well they meet the needs and expectations that researchers have when they are looking for resources to solve their information need. If an online finding aid does meet their expectations or their needs for solving their information need, then it's probably going to be more likely that they are actually going to use the online finding aid to attempt to find the information that they're looking for. If they go into an online finding aid and they're like, wow, this is really poorly organized, I don't know what half of this stuff means, and this is really making me not want to use this repository, so I'm just going to walk away, then it's probably less likely that they're going to end up using the resources that an archive has to offer, which is obviously unfortunate, right? Because as archives, we want people to use our materials. And the same is true for online collections, as we have already discussed in this course. So when researchers come to online finding aids and to online collections, they have a certain set of expectations as far as what they're going to be exposed to. And unfortunately, what they expect or hope to be exposed to might be very different from what an archive actually offers or what an archive can offer for them in order to support their researcher needs and support their effort in solving their information need and finding the information that they're looking for. And there can be a lot of reasons for this disconnect. It might be due to a lack of awareness on the part of archives about what researchers want and expect. Archives may not really know that researchers are expecting to have a nice shower and a bath, and they just say, well, here's a bath, not really knowing that a researcher might want additional features that the archive isn't providing. An archive might not know that a researcher wants 2 sinks, and so they just say, okay, well, here's a sink. So there can definitely be a disconnect between what archives think researchers want and need and what researchers actually want and need. And a part of that might also be due to a lack of an understanding on the behalf of researchers about what archives can provide. They may not understand the resource constraints that archives live under, and the archives are not able to provide, every single feature and have every single record in an archive described to the minutest detail, and that they might not be able to access that level of description through an online finding aid. It's just archives have finite resources to devote to the development and sharing of online finding aids, and researchers might not really understand that sort of pragmatic aspect of running and operating an archive. So a great thing about outreach is it can help diminish this disconnect. It can help make researchers more aware of what archives can offer and maybe why they're only able to offer particular services. But not everyone is going to certainly be exposed to that kind of outreach or have a more pragmatic understanding of archives and what archives can offer. So this disconnect can continue to exist. That's probably more understandable and more excusable than the first possibility that I mentioned, which is archives simply not knowing what researchers want and thus being unable to meet those needs. And this really goes back to the discussions that we have had in this already in this semester about archives focusing on researcher services. So one aspect of researcher services is quite explicitly that finding aids and services are geared to users' needs. If archives aren't working with researchers to finding out what tools and features they want in online finding aids, among other services, they aren't really having a research services focus, and they're not focusing on the needs of the people that want to use archives. And again, this lack of focus can result in a real difference between what researchers need and what researchers expect and what archives can provide. And this can obviously result in researchers feeling disappointed, researchers not having the support that they need to solve their information need, and ultimately researchers not being interested in using archives, which again, not an ideal situation for archival repositories to find themselves in. So the ideal situation is that online finding aids adhere to archival standards. So they meet the sort of bare minimum criteria that describing archives a content standard recommends, and that they also meet researcher needs so that they are aware of what researchers want and are able to at least approximate meeting those researcher needs through online finding aids. Now I have a question mark next to adhere to standards because if you look at sort of the bare minimum for DAX, it's still pretty basic, bare bones information, which might meet the needs of, you know, some researchers, but certainly not all researchers, or probably even most researchers. So even just adhering to standards isn't really going to get the job done. So archives might have to kind of look beyond just what DAX recommends and say, well, we should really provide this additional information. So it has to be a combination of adhering to standards and meeting researcher needs. And that will help archives develop the perfect finding aid, the one that supports research using archives and make researchers feel like they are interacting with an archives that is competent, that has value, and that deserves to be used and supported in the future. And it's particularly important that online finding aids are perfect, or at least as near to perfect as archives can get them, because as the Freund article notes, online finding aids challenge the original notion that archives would be nearby when researchers are interacting with online finding aids. So online finding aids are accessed just like that, online. A researcher may be hundreds of miles away from an archive when they're looking at an archive's online finding aid, and that can be isolating. It can result in a disconnect between the researcher and the expertise of the archivist sitting around waiting to answer questions about a collection. And so because of this isolating nature of online finding aids, it's very important that archives understand what researcher needs are, because they may not be able to be there to answer immediate questions about what a particular term is, or where the heck in the finding aid am I, or whatever other issues a researcher might be having. Now, of course, you can reduce this isolated nature by having features on an archive's website or even embedded within online finding aids that connect researchers to archivists. So having some of the instant messaging tools that the Pidal article mentioned. It could be as simple as just having an email to reference staff embedded somewhere in the finding aid. And these things can reduce the disconnect and sense of isolation that researchers might feel and allow there to be more of a kind of back and forth between researchers and the archivists who at least ideally have more expertise about a collection the researcher is looking at or just how to use a finding aid in general. So perfect online finding aids can be very supportive of archival advocacy. So finding aids that do adhere to standards and do meet researcher needs and researcher expectations are going to be easier for researchers to use. And that's going to result in people, in a lot of instances, maybe not in every instance, but in a lot of instances, using those finding aids to solve their information needs and having a positive interaction with the archive and with the resources that the archive has to offer. And this can result in more direct uses of archival collections and more indirect uses of archival collections as well. So it can result in more people interacting with in archives as researchers themselves, and also those people creating more materials that people indirectly come into contact with. And as I've talked about before, these uses can be great pieces of information that archives can use to advocate for increased resources for the archive. So resource allocators, stakeholders like to see these use statistics. They like to understand that the archive's materials are being used by researchers, and that can certainly create an environment in which resource allocators are more supportive of the archives, view the archives more favorably, and as a valuable member of a organization, and that can certainly translate into more support for the archive in the future. So in order to look at how well finding aids meet researcher needs and expectations, it's always helpful to look at an example. And so this is an online finding aid from the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center, which I've kind of looked at off and on throughout this course. And this is the inventory for the Forrest J. Ackerman papers. So a couple of things right off the bat here. There is a nice email for the HC's reference department. So there's some of that connectivity that I talked about before between the online finding aid and the researcher. So if you have a question about this collection or about how to use the finding aid, you can just click on the old email there and send the HC a message. Maybe not the most direct and kind of instantaneous form of connection, but certainly better than nothing at all. So one thing that our readings for this week mentioned as far as what researchers like to see and not see in online finding aids is the presence of hierarchy. On page 7 in the Chapman article, the author notes that when researchers are viewing finding aids, they really want to find information quickly, and they don't want to have to navigate through the finding aids hierarchy as archivists may have intended. So we archivists love to have our series and all that kind of showing how everything is related, maybe a few like sub-series, but that's not something that researchers are necessarily interested in. They may not be as interested in the overall context. They just want to find the information that they're looking for. So going back to the principle of least effort, which we talked about earlier on in this semester. So again, while this hierarchy might sort of meet archival professional standards and ideals, it's not necessarily something that a lot of researchers are interested in. And if you have to kind of scroll through all this stuff just to find what you're looking for, you know, that can be something that can deter a lot of researchers. Another key thing that researchers want to see in online finding aids, and it's related to being able to avoid all of this kind of unnecessary and really unwanted hierarchy, is the importance of having good navigation. And that's something that we talked about with exhibits as well. Researchers want to be able to move around throughout an online finding aid in a manner that is efficient and requires some effort, but not a whole lot of effort. So ease of navigation is really important. On page 554, the Daniels and Yeakel article talk about having a navigation bar on the side of an online finding aid, which we can certainly see here. So you can click through series to series, which is helpful if you are just interested in seeing the books that Ackerman collected. You can just go right to books, although it's kind of weird that when you click on something, it goes a little bit below it and you have to scroll up and find more what you're looking for. So maybe that's not an ideal navigation feature of this finding aid. The Chapman article mentions having these hyperlinked series quick links, which again is typically what you'll see in these sidebars here. They also talk about having hover captions over these navigational links, which may give more in-depth descriptions of what users would find if they navigate to the section in question. So maybe you would have a series note that would pop up if you hovered over this particular series link. That might be something nice to have. I think people, as one of our readings noted, are used to kind of disregarding pop-up things. And if it's not information that a researcher really wants or needs, then that's just going to kind of get in the way. So if you're going through all of these and there's kind of popping up and covering up the next link that you do want to click on, that might not be ideal. So sometimes the simplest way to do things is the best, as we see here, just kind of straight links and no other bells and whistles. One great thing about a feature like this is that it is something that a lot of people can use and understand. It's pretty straightforward, right? If I am interested in correspondence and fan mail, I click on the link to Series 4 and it takes me, I guess, more or less to information about Series 4. So maybe more advanced participants are interested in all the hierarchical information and the contextual information and so on and so forth. But for people that just, again, want pretty easy and straightforward access to different information in the finding aid, these links are a very serviceable alternative. As the Freud article notes, it's good to have this always available. So if I scrolled down and this disappeared, that wouldn't be ideal. So it's nice that it's kind of fixed there in its own separate section. I kind of wonder what this broken thing is. So that's a beneficial feature of this online finding aid as well. Another thing that a few of the readings for this week talked about was the benefit of doing good old Control F. So being able to Control F and say, okay, I'm just interested in materials that Ackerman had related to Frankenstein. Okay, so you can see that there are 30 things that pop up, and then you can kind of click through these and see which one seems most relevant to your information need. Probably Frankenstein meets the space monster would be most relevant to my information need because it sounds cool, but you know, your mileage may vary. And again, this is a navigational tool that a lot of people are used to, a lot of people understand. It can connect you to very detailed information. It doesn't take a lot of effort, and is something that pretty much every browser is going to support. Of course, where Control F becomes less valuable is if a collection is not described very carefully or very thoroughly. So if for this collection there was just a series that said posters and lobby cards, and maybe there was a box level description, but we didn't have this item level information, then doing Control F wouldn't be as useful as it is with this particular collection because there is such a good amount of detail to it. And given how useful Control F is and how easy it is to use and how used to it people are, that really suggests the importance of good description. And maybe that's an argument that archivists could use when advocating for improved resources to describe materials more thoroughly, because then that description gets translated into an online collection, which really supports the Control F search feature that pretty much every researcher knows about and feels comfortable with, and is going to be interested in using to discover information. Again, it's just a good way to find information more specific to what your information need is without having to scroll through all this stuff and saying, okay, is the poster that I'm looking for here, or what's going on? Another thing that our readings for this week discussed is the use of terminology. And this is something that archivists can be guilty of from time to time. We're professionals, there's a certain lingo that archivists use, whether because we want to or because we feel like we need to, because we want to sound professional. For whatever reason, there are words like, as the Daniels and Yackel article note, content, context, provenance, scope and content. Researchers might not really understand what these terms mean, and if they see these terms in an online finding aid, that might be a little confusing to them and make them feel like, okay, I don't understand what's going on here, and this is kind of intimidating, and maybe I need help, or I'm just going to stop looking at this because I don't know what's going on. One interesting feature here is, well, I guess just overall, this online finding aid doesn't really have a whole lot of jargon to it, especially for the links on the side or the kind of field titles. They're all pretty straightforward. So a collection summary, most people know what that means. Biography of Forrest J. Ackerman, pretty straightforward. Scope and content, that might be one that is a little confusing to people. It could just say, I don't know, maybe collection summary might be a better description for this field, and you could do something else for this part up here. Restrictions, people will probably have a pretty good idea what that means, but maybe not. Access terms, that's actually something that our readings talk about as being kind of a source of confusion for some people. So maybe what an access term is could be described, or maybe that's not the best term for what these are. But generally speaking, I'm not seeing a ton of kind of jargon and lingo on this particular find aid. It's really pretty straightforward and easy to understand. And I think it would be for most people. And we have these little series notes which kind of go into more detail about what is in each series, and these are pretty lingo free as well, although they're not for every series. So yeah, as Rune notes, if you have terminology that is presented without context, or maybe a little inconsistently within a find aid, that can be confusing to researchers, and it might be something that makes the researchers not want to engage with find aids as much as they would otherwise. Another topic that is mentioned in one of our readings, the Daniels and Yackel article, is the inconsistency of terminology across different find aids and across different institutions. And that's something that can confuse researchers as well. Obviously, it's difficult to tell how this finding aid and the terminology it uses compares to finding aids at a bunch of other archives. But certainly something to be aware of, that at least within your own institution, you're using terms in the same way, and you have some consistency across your find aids, because that way, if researchers are looking at more than one collection, they won't be like, well, this means one thing in this collection or in this find aid, and it seems to mean something else here, and I don't really understand why or what's going on. So having some consistency with your terminology, at least within your own institution, you can't necessarily control what other archives do, can be a way to make working with find aids less confusing for your researchers. Another important consideration for online find aids is the amount of detail that is provided. So you might think the more the merrier, right? Just kind of put in as much detail as you want, and that's what researchers are going to expect and what they are going to desire. But that isn't necessarily the case. The Daniels and Yackel article advocate for a level of detail sufficient to start research, but not overwhelming. They recommend avoiding long blocks of text, which this find aid does pretty well. I've seen some other find aids out there that it's just like they wrote a book for the biography or the scope and content, and it's like, okay, I guess you could control F through it and find what you want, but it's just kind of overwhelming and doesn't really paint a very welcoming picture. And again, as the Chapman article notes, rather than reading blocks of text to acquire contextual information, people just want to go to the materials that they're desired. So if you have these long blocks of text, people might just do a Control F and just kind of ignore what you wrote anyway. So yeah, you want to have enough detail to get your researcher started, but you don't want to bludgeon them with detail after detail after detail, when they might just need a very specific piece of information to solve their information need. The last thing that I'll talk about is the importance for researchers to know if materials in an online find aid are available online or not. And that's something that the Walton article notes on pages 6 and 12. And the author talks about that researchers may have the expectation that everything is online. So again, getting back to the difference between what researcher expectations are and what archivists are actually able to provide. So it's important that archivists are upfront and clear about what information is online and what information isn't. And this is something that this FindAid does pretty well. So if you scroll down, you can see that some of these posters have links to them. And so you can click on the link and you'll go to the record that the link corresponds to. So the brain machine sounds like a pretty interesting to me. The waves of the brain machine spell stop this killer. So, okay, an interesting premise. So again, just a way to let researchers know what is online and what they can access immediately versus what they might need to contact a researcher to contact. Some other FindAids that I've seen, the New York Public Library Archives at the very least has a feature in their online FindAids where you can filter so that you only look at records that are online, and that might be a good thing to do because otherwise you might not know which records are online without, again, having to kind of scroll through this whole FindAid and having a little bit of a filter that maybe just shows you what's online would be a good thing to have as well. So that might be a feature that would improve this particular online FindAid. And of course, again, it's so important that you place online materials in context. So it's good to note that, yes, the Forrest J. Ackerman collection has photographs of him, but it also has all these other photographs as well, and the same with the posters. So just making these contextual relationships clear to researchers, you know, in the off chance that they care about that kind of stuff, is a good thing to do. Well, I guess I'll talk about one more thing actually, and that is Web 2.0 features in online FindAids. And that's something that Walton talks about on page 46. So the author mentions that it could include things like comment boxes, annotations, tagging, word clouds, starring and saving features, and so on. She talks about how these tools are relatively unexplored in usability studies. I haven't seen a lot of this in online FindAids. I know the New York Public Library's online FindAids have some kind of word cloud relationship features. I think they have them like under an experimental tab or something like that. So these features are out there. I haven't seen them widely adopted by archives. I think when you start thinking about user participation and annotations and tagging and all that other stuff, it can clutter up an online FindAid pretty quickly. And it's pretty questionable whether or not researchers want to have that kind of clutter. But you know, it can certainly provide some additional details to the FindAid as well. So I guess as long as it could be done in a way that doesn't really get in the way of maybe what the researcher is more interested in, which might be the archival perspective, then it could be a useful tool. But again, not really something that I've seen too widely in the online FindAids that I've looked at. I haven't looked at all of them. I like to think that I've looked at quite a few, but again, not something that I've widely seen, at least in archives and online FindAids in the US. So we will go ahead and end there. I hope that this lecture has made you think more about how online FindAids fit into the context of other forms of outreach, other processes that archives engage in, how they might fit in with the research process that a researcher might undergo. And I hope that it's helped you think about some of the different features that researchers, at least according to the readings for this week, like and dislike, and how some of those features have, or in some cases haven't, been implemented in at least one online archive. So again, this is just one online FINAID among probably thousands and thousands out there. But this is a pretty flagship collection for the AHC, so I think that they would put a lot of resources into developing this collection and developing this FINAID, so I thought it would be an interesting example to look at. But again, every archive is going to do online FINAIDs a little bit differently, which is where a lot of the confusion comes from. And some are going to have some features and others are going to have other features. And you can really understand why it starts to get confusing for researchers, because they might see something completely different from archive to archive, and it can just get confusing out there. But it really is important that archives do support researchers and support them in meeting their information needs. And hopefully by doing so, the archive is better able to demonstrate its value and better able to facilitate use, which will help the archives advocate for improved infrastructure and wealth and health into the future. So as always, thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions, and take care.